He sits quietly in first class, dark skin catching the cabin lights that weren't meant to flatter him. Ticket paid in full, and still not enough to buy respect. Around him, murmurs sharpen to laughter, polite smiles peel back to show teeth, and every sir drips with practiced contempt. He doesn't argue, not yet. They think they know exactly who he is, another charity case sneaking into their world, one they can shove aside and humiliate while everyone pretends not to see. But there's something else simmering beneath his silence, something they don't bother to imagine. The quiet, deliberate resolve of a man who holds more leverage than their entire company can afford to lose. They're about to learn what it costs to confuse dignity for weakness. If you want to see how that lesson unfolds, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment about what you think of this plot. And let me know where you're watching from. Let's dig into it together. Ellis Prentice felt a heavy, anxious weight in his chest as he entered the terminal, gripping the worn strap of his faded canvas duffel bag and clutching his crumpled first-class boarding pass like it was a promise he had made to himself. He wore jeans that had lost their color to 1,000 wash cycles and a pale green t-shirt with a collar sagging from years of wear, clothes that marked him immediately as out of place among the expensive suits and designer luggage that filled the gate area. He checked the glowing monitor above the gate one more time, reassuring himself that it really did say Group 1, First Class and Priority, before taking a deep breath and stepping forward. The boarding area buzzed with the din of conversation and rolling suitcases, but Ellis heard every sound as if it were magnified, every rustle and murmur a reminder that he did not belong here. When the announcement finally crackled through the speakers, now boarding Group 1, First Class and Priority customers, his pulse quickened with cautious relief. He stepped into line behind sharply dressed professionals, their cologne mixing with the harsh smell of burnt airport coffee, and forced himself to keep his chin high. When he reached the front of the line, he held out his ticket, willing his hand not to shake, offering it to the gate agent with a polite but nervous smile. The agent, a slim man with a perfectly ironed navy blazer and a plastic badge pinned crookedly to his lapel, didn't even glance at the boarding pass. Instead, his gaze dropped dismissively to Ellis's old clothes before flicking to the well-dressed man behind him. Raising a hand to stop Ellis like he was traffic, the agent's voice cut through the noise, louder than necessary. "Hold on, sir. Priority only right now." Confusion flashed across Ellis's face as he blinked at the boarding pass in his hand. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice even, polite. "This is Priority, Group 1, First Class." The agent didn't even bother looking at the ticket, instead waving the man behind Ellis forward with a smile so bright it looked painful. "Welcome aboard, sir." Ellis felt his face flush as he shifted on his feet, people behind him starting to stare. He tried again, voice lower but firmer. "Excuse me, I think there's a mistake. This is Group 1. The agent sighed dramatically and shook his head with the patronizing patience of someone explaining something to a child. "Sir, please don't hold up the line. Step aside. We need to get our real first-class travelers on first." Laughter rippled through the line behind him. A woman with platinum hair and designer sunglasses snorted and whispered loudly to her husband. Unbelievable. He should know better. Ellis's mouth went dry as his heart slammed painfully in his chest. He felt the blood rushing in his ears, drowning out the dull boarding chimes and announcements. He tried to hold the ticket higher, but his hand shook visibly. "I have Group 1, he whispered, voice cracking with humiliation. The agent's face hardened, eyes narrowing as though Ellis's mere insistence was an offense. "Listen, buddy, don't make this difficult. Step aside now." Someone behind him snapped, "Come on, man, just move." Another person muttered, "Holding us all up because he doesn't know how to read a ticket." Ellis swallowed hard, tasting the sour bile rising in his throat. He felt the heat of all those eyes burning into him. His fingers clenched around the boarding pass, crumpling it slightly as he slowly backed away. The agent immediately smiled at the next passenger, ignoring Ellis entirely. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," he chirped cheerfully, as though Ellis had never existed. Ellis stood pressed against the wall, trying to disappear, trying not to see the sneers, the smirks, the disapproving shakes of heads. His vision blurred for a moment as he blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears spill onto his cheeks. He heard another announcement, final call for Group 1, first class and priority. He licked his dry lips and stepped forward one more time, offering the crumpled ticket with trembling fingers. The agent didn't even look at him as he snatched it away. He squinted at it with mocking care. "Oh, first class. My mistake," he drawled, voice dripping with sarcasm. Then he tossed the ticket back at Ellis like trash, his words cold and dismissive. "But you waited too long. We're on Group 2 now. You'll have to wait." Ellis's mouth fell open, but no sound came out. He felt like he had been slapped. The laughter behind him swelled again. A teenage girl mimicked the agent's dismissive hand wave, laughing cruelly with her friend. He stood frozen, the humiliation thick in his throat like wet cement. For a long moment, he didn't move. He couldn't. He felt like the floor would swallow him whole if he dared to take a step. When the final boarding call for Group 2 was announced, he finally shuffled forward, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground, praying that no one would look at him, praying that no one would see the shame carved into his face. The agent didn't bother acknowledging him as he passed, muttering under his breath, "Finally." As he approached the aircraft door, the uniformed flight attendant at the threshold gave him a look that was too brief to be polite and too sharp to be neutral. She didn't say welcome or even hello. She merely motioned with a jerk of her chin as if directing livestock and turned her attention to the passenger behind him. He kept going. The interior of the plane both a refuge from the crowd and a new stage for his humiliation. He moved down the aisle, bag-bumping seats, avoiding eye contact with the passengers already settled, their eyes flicking over his clothes before darting away. When he reached the first-class section, his assigned seat right there waiting for him, he paused for half a breath. He allowed himself 1 second to imagine sinking into the wide leather seat, putting this behind him. But as he reached to stow his bag in the overhead, a voice snapped behind him, sharp as a whip crack. "Excuse me, sir, stop right there." Ellis turned slowly, heart sinking as he recognized the gate agent striding up the aisle, eyes narrowed, mouth twisted with contempt. The man didn't bother lowering his voice. "I told you to wait your turn. What are you doing in here?" Ellis tried to answer, voice shaking. "This is my seat." He held up the battered boarding pass again, fingers trembling slightly. The agent snatched it without a glance. "Security," he barked over his shoulder. The word was a gunshot in the hush of the first-class cabin. Heads turned, eyes widened. Whispers rippled through the space. A woman clutched her designer purse closer. A man with a gold watch raised his phone, ready to record. Ellis felt the floor tilt beneath him as 2 uniformed security guards pushed up the aisle. The agent waved them forward like hounds. "This man is refusing to comply. He's causing a disturbance. Says he's in first class. Look at him." The words stung more than any slap. Ellis's mouth worked uselessly. He felt panic boiling under his ribs. "I'm not causing anything," he tried, voice ragged. "This is my seat. It's on my ticket." One guard, a big man with a thick neck and a badge gleaming on his chest, narrowed his eyes. "Sir, step aside." "Now." Ellis swallowed, his eyes darting around the cabin. He saw faces peering over headrests, phones held discreetly at chest height, filming. He saw judgment in their eyes, saw fear, saw that they were looking for a show and didn't care who played the clown. He felt the shame crawl up his spine like ice water. "Please," he whispered, voice cracking. "I just want to sit." The second guard, older with graying temples and eyes like flint, grabbed Ellis's arm. "I said move." Ellis stumbled back a step, gasping at the sudden grip. The big guard closed in, blocking the aisle. "Let's make sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be." The words landed like a slap in the silence. Ellis felt his stomach drop. "What?" I didn't do anything." But the older guard was already reaching for his belt radio. "Got a possible non-compliant. We're conducting a search." The younger one twisted Ellis's arm behind his back and pushed him against the cabin wall. A woman in the front row actually flinched back, clutching her pearls. Ellis felt the breath knocked from his lungs. He tried to speak, to protest, but the words stuck in his throat. The big guard's voice was harsh, rehearsed. Any sharp objects? Any contraband? Anything you people usually carry?" Ellis felt his eyes sting. He tried to shake his head, but the hand on his arm held him still. The older guard patted him down roughly, slapping at his pockets hard enough to bruise. He winced, humiliated beyond words, as the search was performed in full view of the cabin, with the flight attendant watching impassively, lips pressed in a thin line of approval. His bag was yanked open, clothes and toiletries dumped onto the aisle floor, his toothbrush skidding under a seat. The younger guard scowled at the contents. "Yeah, real classy. Just as I thought." Ellis's chest heaved as he struggled to keep breathing. He felt stripped bare, exposed not just to the guards, but to every camera, every pair of eyes recording his downfall. He could hear passengers whispering, laughing quietly, even as some tooted in fake sympathy. "Disgraceful," he heard one man mutter, not clear if he meant Ellis or the scene itself. A woman said in a hushed but audible voice, "Well, you can't be too careful these days." Ellis felt something snap deep in his chest, something that had always let him hold his head high even in the worst moments. He felt it break and fall away. The older guard finally stepped back, tossing his empty bag onto the floor. "He's clean," he said dismissively. The younger one let go of his arm with a final shove that made him stagger. Ellis blinked at them, chest heaving, too stunned to speak. The gate agent smirked triumphantly. "See? No problem. Now get him out of the way. He's delaying the flight." The older guard nodded. "Come on. We'll have you talk to the supervisor." Ellis turned to the rows of watching faces, but no one met his eyes. They looked away, embarrassed, complicit, eager to be anywhere but part of a shame. When they reached the gate, the guards wordlessly dropped him in front of the check-in counter like a delivery gone wrong and turned away without so much as a backward glance. Ellis glanced around for the gate agent and found the man leaning against the desk, chatting with another airline employee in a red vest. Their laughter stopped when they saw him approach, replaced by thin, patronizing smiles. He cleared his throat softly, voice cracking. "Can I please speak with a supervisor?" The gate agent didn't even bother to straighten his posture. He just smirked and gestured at Ellis's clothes with a flick of his eyes. "About what?" "You had your little performance already. We're done." Ellis felt the words like slaps. He took a breath, forced it out slowly, gripping his battered boarding pass in shaking fingers. "This is my seat," he said as calmly as he could manage, fighting the tremor in his voice. "I paid for it. I just want to get on the flight." The agent rolled his eyes and snatched the boarding pass from his hand with exaggerated impatience. Yeah, let's see this so-called ticket." He held it up theatrically, showing it to the woman in the red vest as though it were some kind of joke they shared. She giggled, then covered her mouth quickly, eyes dancing with amusement. Ellis felt his stomach churn, bile rising in his throat. He tried to speak again, but the words tangled in his mouth. The agent bent the ticket back and forth, creasing it deeply until the paper fibers began to split. He squinted at it with faux seriousness. "Looks fake to me," he said, voice rising so that everyone around could hear. A couple of passengers who had just entered the gate area paused to watch, their eyes eager for drama. Ellis's ears burned as the agent continued, fingers pressing into the pass until with a small rip, it tore right down the middle. "Oops," the agent said in a voice dripping with mock innocence. He dropped the torn halves onto the counter. "Guess you'll have to find another way to get where you're going." The woman in the red vest snickered openly now, not bothering to hide it. Ellis's heart thudded painfully. He stared at the ruined ticket, his mouth dry, chest tight, feeling his pulse hammering in his temples. He swallowed hard. "Please," he whispered, his voice shaking so badly it didn't sound like his own. "That was my boarding pass. I need to get on. Please just let me talk to someone who can help." The agent leaned in, eyes cold, voice low and mocking. "Look around, buddy. You think someone here is going to help you." He glanced over Ellis's shoulder, voice rising cheerfully. "Hey, everybody, check this out. He's trying to talk his way onto first class without a ticket." Laughter burst from somewhere behind Ellis, the cruel, amused sound of people enjoying the spectacle. He didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see their faces. He felt the humiliation burning down his neck, pulling heavy in his gut. He tried to speak, to plead, but the words caught in his throat. The agent picked up the shredded halves of the ticket and fluttered them in the air like confetti. "Maybe you can tape it back together, huh?" The woman in the red vest laughed, so hard she snorted. "Guess you're walking to your destination now," she cackled, wiping tears from the corners of her eyes. The agent leaned back and roared with fake laughing glee. "Hey, maybe Greyhound will take you. I hear they're less picky about appearance." The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Ellis felt his vision blur as he blinked furiously, refusing to let the tears fall. His knuckles whitened around the strap of his bag as his fingers dug in, nails biting the fabric. He tried to breathe, but his lungs wouldn't work right. He saw the agent's smirk, heard the snide laughter, felt the dull throb of embarrassment that still pulsed like a bruise across his entire body. His chest hurt from holding back sobs, and when he finally managed to swallow, it scraped his throat raw like broken glass. He wiped his face with his sleeve, smearing tears across his cheek, trying desperately to compose himself before anyone else could notice his weakness. Around him, the gate area had mostly cleared out as the final groups boarded, but a few stragglers lingered, casting curious or dismissive glances in his direction before looking quickly away. He could hear whispers, low and cutting, as though they thought he was too stupid or too beaten down to understand. He lowered his gaze to the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes, willing himself to disappear. He was so lost in the roaring silence in his head that he didn't notice the gate agent approaching until a shadow fell across him. He blinked up slowly, his heart stuttering with a sick mix of dread and desperate hope. Maybe they had realized their mistake. Maybe someone had finally decided to do the right thing. But the agent's smirk told him otherwise before a single word was spoken. The agent dangled something in front of him between two pinched fingers, a fresh boarding pass. Ellis felt his chest seize with conflicting emotions, relief, suspicion, confusion. But before he could say anything, the agent spoke in that same bright, mocking tone he had used to draw laughter from the crowd earlier. "You want to fly so bad?" he said, loud enough that a few nearby passengers turned to watch, smirking knowingly. "Fine. We found you a seat. Don't say we're not accommodating." He let the pass fall from his fingers, so it landed in Ellis's lap like trash. Ellis felt the sting of the insult but forced himself to pick it up with trembling fingers, reading the seat assignment. The numbers didn't register at first. Then he realized. The very last row. Seat 37E. He glanced back up at the agent in horror. "That's by the lavatory," he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying and silence alike. The agent's eyes glittered with mean amusement. He shrugged one shoulder lazily. "Hey, beggars can't be choosers." He leaned in close enough that Ellis could smell the cheap aftershave and coffee on his breath. "Don't worry, smells should feel familiar." The words hit Ellis like a slap. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He felt his face flame, shame and rage mixing into a nauseating swirl that made him lightheaded. He wanted to stand, to scream, to demand the respect he had paid for and deserved. But he was paralyzed by the weight of every pair of eyes in the gate area on him. He could see them watching, phone still out and recording, eager to catch his reaction, to share his humiliation with anyone who would watch. The agent straightened up and patted his shoulder with mock gentleness. "Now hurry up," he said, voice hardening as his hand squeezed just a little too tightly. "Don't hold up the real passengers." Ellis swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. His fingers dug into the new boarding pass, so hard it crumpled immediately. He felt like a child being scolded for something he hadn't done. He gathered his bag, shoving his belongings back in haphazardly, wiping tears on his sleeve again before standing up slowly. His knees shook as he tried to steady himself. The agent made a sweeping gesture with his arm, as if to clear the path for him, and gave an exaggerated bow. "Your chariot awaits." Ellis felt the heat in his cheeks, the sting in his eyes, but he kept his head down, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of seeing him cry again. He forced himself to walk slowly, deliberately, his legs like lead, each step harder than the last. As he approached the gate, the red-vested woman who had laughed at him earlier was there, scanning final passengers. She didn't even try to hide her smirk as she took his pass, her eyes flicking over his crumpled clothes before rolling skyward in mock exasperation. The scanner beeped and she shoved the pass back into his chest, so hard he almost dropped it. "Try not to get lost this time," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. Ellis mumbled something like thank you out of reflex, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. He turned toward the jet bridge, feeling the weight of every person behind him watching him go, some with laughter in their eyes, some with disgust, and worse, some with pity. He hated them all equally in that moment, hated them for witnessing his humiliation and doing nothing. He tried to slow his breathing, tried to ignore the chatter and laughter drifting down from first class, tried to forget the gate agent's smirk and those hateful words about smells that should feel familiar. But they buzzed in his ears like a swarm of wasps, stinging over and over with the certainty that he did not belong, that no one here wanted him, that he was something to be tolerated if not discarded. He felt dirty in a way no shower would ever wash away, like the shame had seeped under his skin and made a home there. The plane's engines rumbled to life as more passengers squeezed down the aisle, luggage bumping shoulders. Voices raised in impatient complaints about overhead space, the lights harsh and unflattering, turning everyone's expressions pinched and irritable. Ellis tried to make himself smaller, leaning sideways to let people pass, his seat vibrating every time someone shoved a bag overhead or dropped in the aisle. But there was no hiding from the hostility in the glances they shot him, the way their eyes darted to his crumpled clothes and then away quickly, like he was a stain on the fabric of their flight experience. He didn't meet anyone's eyes, just stared at the floor, jaw tight, throat thick with the taste of old humiliation, wishing he could be anywhere but here, wishing he had never bought that ticket, never dared to think he could have something nice. He heard a scuffle at the front as a flight attendant in a pressed uniform with a neat bun and a frown that seemed carved in stone stepped into the aisle, barking orders for people to find their seats and sit down. She moved like a drill sergeant, her voice slicing through the low murmur of conversation, and Ellis felt a sick twist in his stomach as her gaze raked the rows and landed on him. He looked down, praying she'd move on, but she didn't. She started forward with quick, clipped steps, the heels of her polished shoes snapping against the floor. "Move it," she snapped when she was still 2 rows away, voice loud enough to turn heads. Ellis startled, blinking at her in confusion, but before he could say anything, she was towering over him, eyes hard and mouth tight. "You're holding up real customers," she spat, her voice dripping with disdain, so clear it made his skin crawl. He opened his mouth to protest, the words catching in his raw throat. "I'm in my seat," he managed hoarsely, his voice cracking like brittle glass. "Excuse me." Her eyebrows shot up and the entire section seemed to freeze. She drew herself up taller, glaring at him like he'd just insulted her family. "Don't you dare talk back to me," she hissed, voice rising to carry over the seats. "You people are always so aggressive." The words felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of him. He froze, mouth open, face burning, so hot he thought he might ignite. Around them, passengers fell silent, the buzz of complaint and conversation dying as they turned to watch the new spectacle. Someone 2 rows up raised a phone, angling it carefully. A man with thinning hair and an expensive watch snorted loudly. "Figures," he muttered to the woman next to him, who nodded sympathetically as if she were witnessing a public safety threat. Ellis's eyes darted from face to face, searching for someone, anyone, who might stand up for him. But they all turned away or watched with open, eager curiosity. His heart pounded like it was trying to escape his chest. He swallowed, but his throat felt like it was stuffed with sand. He tried again, voice cracking. I'm not," but the words fell apart halfway out. She cut him off with a slicing gesture of her hand. "Quiet," she snapped, the command ringing through the cabin. "You've caused enough problems today." Her gaze swept the nearby passengers as if seeking allies, and she found them in nods, in muttered agreements, in the way people shifted away from him with exaggerated discomfort. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice so that only he could hear the next part, though he knew everyone nearby would catch enough to understand. "I don't know why they even let you people on these flights," she hissed, the words slow and deliberate like she was savoring each one. He clutched his battered duffel bag to his chest like a shield, the canvas edges biting into his arms as he tried to make himself as small as possible, willing himself to disappear entirely. But there was no escaping the heat of all those eyes that kept glancing his way, flicking over his clothes, his skin, and then sliding off with silent judgments and quick, dismissive contempt. The cabin was heavy with the rustle of settling passengers, the hiss of overhead bins closing, the forced cheer of safety demonstrations that played like a cruel joke over the intercom. Ellis didn't look up, his gaze fixed firmly on the seat back in front of him, scarred with scratches and gouged initials, trying not to hear the whispering around him, the snickers that rose and fell in cruel waves as people passed along the story of the troublemaker in the back, who wouldn't just sit down and be quiet. He pressed his forehead against the cool plastic, breathing shallowly, trying to hold in the raw, scraping sob that threatened to claw its way up his throat. Just as he thought maybe, just maybe, they would leave him alone now, he felt a shadow fall over him, the presence at his side cold and imposing like a storm cloud. He flinched instinctively, turning his head to see another flight attendant towering in the narrow aisle, a man with silver hair, perfectly pressed navy uniform, and an expression of stony authority that seemed carved in granite. The man's eyes raked over Ellis with barely concealed distaste before dropping to the duffel bag clutched to his chest and the crumpled boarding pass tucked inside it. The attendant's voice was cold, practiced, and loud enough for the entire back section to hear. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stand up." Ellis blinked at him, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on dry land. His voice was raw and papery when he managed to speak. "I'm in my seat," he said, his fingers tightening around the bag. "This is my seat." The attendant didn't flinch, didn't soften. Instead, he leaned in just enough to loom over Ellis like a judge ready to deliver a sentence. "We've had complaints about your behavior, sir. Stand up now so I can verify you're supposed to be here." Ellis felt his blood go ice cold. He shook his head minutely, terror clawing at his chest. "Please," he whispered, voice cracking. I didn't do anything." But the attendant was relentless. "Stand up now, or I will have you removed from a flight." Ellis felt his legs tremble as he tried to unfold them from the cramped space, his knees knocking painfully against the armrest as he rose unsteadily. His bag slipped from his grasp, thumping to the floor at his feet. He winced at the sound, cheeks burning as everyone in earshot twisted to look at him, necks craning with greedy curiosity. The flight attendant yanked the boarding pass from the fallen bag and turned it over with deliberate slowness, eyes narrowing as if reading a suspicious document. He flicked a glance over Ellis again, taking in the faded jeans, the frayed green t-shirt, the sweat-dampened hair plastered to his forehead. He snorted softly, a sound of unmistakable derision that rippled through the silence like a thrown stone. Behind him, someone whispered loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "Seriously? He's still here." A woman 2 seats up let out a quiet, mean little laugh, while her companion shook his head with exaggerated pity. "Should have just let him walk," he murmured, and they both giggled behind their hands. Ellis felt the words slice him to ribbons. His breathing hitched as the attendant finally handed back the pass with a sneer. "Barely readable," he said, voice dripping with disgust. "I'll be watching you. Sit." Ellis's legs nearly buckled as he sank back into the seat, shaking so hard he could barely grip the bag to pull it back into his lap. He blinked furiously at the window, hot tears spilling down his face unchecked, but he didn't dare wipe them away. He was too busy trying to hold in the sound that wanted to tear free from his chest, a wretched, keening wail of frustration, fear, and bone-deep humiliation. His cheeks were dry now, the tear tracks rough on his skin, but his eyes burned with the memory of the captain's announcement thanking premium customers for their patience with boarding issues, a phrase that had drawn smug chuckles from the first-class section and cruel snickers from a few seats ahead. He felt raw, scraped hollow, like there was nothing left inside him but the dull echo of humiliation. The engines roared louder as the plane climbed, pressing him deeper into the stained seat cushion that felt like it might swallow him whole. He couldn't look at anyone, couldn't meet the eyes of passengers who would dart away too quickly or linger too long with the satisfied curiosity of people who'd seen exactly what they thought he deserved. He clutched his duffel bag in his lap like armor, fingers wrapped so tightly around the strap that his knuckles were bone white. He tried to focus on breathing, on not drawing attention, on shrinking until he was too small to hurt. But despite every instinct to stay silent, something in him, something deep and stubborn and furious, refused to die quietly. He had taken enough. He had been insulted, shoved, searched like a criminal, publicly mocked, stripped of dignity, and forced to endure every second in front of a gawking, unfeeling audience that thought his pain was entertainment or, worse, justice. He felt the rage bubble up, not the kind that made him lash out, but the cold, measured kind that settled behind his eyes and steadied his voice. He closed them for a second, just to remember who he was, what he'd built, what he commanded outside of this hellish plane. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor in his chest settle into a hard, quiet certainty. With a slow, deliberate movement that felt like pushing against concrete, he reached into the pocket of his duffel and pulled out his phone. The screen lit his face in the dim cabin, showing every crease and line from the grimace he hadn't realized he was wearing. He unlocked it with a swipe and scrolled to his contacts, thumb trembling slightly, before he found the number he needed. He didn't look up. He didn't check who was watching. He didn't care anymore. He lifted the phone to his ear, voice low but clear, cutting through the muted rumble of engines and the uncomfortable shuffle of passengers around him. "This is Ellis Prentice," he said, and though it was quiet, there was steel in it that made the nearest few rows go silent. A woman who had been tittering about something in the seat ahead turned halfway around, her expression caught between interest and confusion. Ellis didn't waver. He listened for the click on the other end, then spoke, slow and precise, like each word was being carved in stone. "I want you to confirm termination of their contract. The full service deal. Effective immediately." His fingers were tight on the phone, his voice even and unflinching despite the pounding of his heart. He felt the weight of the words leave his mouth and settle heavily in the air around him. He heard the intake of breath from the man across the aisle, saw the flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of the woman who had turned to watch. He held the phone closer, jaw tight as the response crackled in his ear. He didn't blink. "Yes," he said, voice softer but just as hard. "That's $5.8 billion. I don't want them seeing a dime. Make it effective immediately." Silence spread like ink and water. Around him, the laughter died. Conversations faltered. Phones lowered, fingers frozen mid-scroll. Even the man who'd snickered should have let him walk earlier had his mouth open now, eyes darting between Ellis and his seatmate in quiet alarm. A teenage girl who had been filming hastily turned off her camera, suddenly unsure if she wanted this moment saved forever. Ellis's pulse thundered in his ears, but he kept his face calm, voice steady, like a blade sliding silently from its sheath. He lowered the phone slightly, breathing through his nose. His eyes narrowed at the floor in front of him, but seeing every ugly word, every insult, every dismissive laugh playing on an endless loop in his mind. The silence that had fallen after his call was absolute, unnatural in a place usually filled with the rustle of safety cards, the hiss of overhead vents, and the low murmur of forced small talk. It was the silence of people realizing they'd misjudged something or someone, and were suddenly afraid of what that meant. The silver-haired flight attendant who had sneered, "Yeah, right," hadn't moved since barking out his dismissive laugh, but the challenge in his voice had faded fast, leaving only a wary, ugly glint in his eyes as he watched Ellis like he was trying to decipher a threat written in an unfamiliar language. Even the man who had chuckled about letting Ellis walk sat stiffly now, eyes on his tray table, fingers tapping out a nervous rhythm that betrayed his unease. The engines hummed beneath them, steady and reassuring in a mechanical way that contrasted sharply with the human discomfort settling like fog in the cabin. Ellis adjusted his grip on his duffel bag, fingers pressing so hard into the canvas that they went numb. His heart still thudded in his chest, but it was a steadier rhythm now, an angry drumbeat that matched the voice in his head repeating, "You don't have to take this anymore," over and over until it wasn't a thought, but a command. He felt the heat of every stare on him, some hostile, some curious, some simply blank with the fear of being forced to pick a side they didn't want to admit existed. He could have sat back and left it there. He could have let the threat hang in the air like a guillotine over the airline's neck and watched them squirm in silence for the rest of the flight. But something in him refused to be satisfied with that. He wanted them to know. He wanted them to hear it from him, not in some corporate memo or news story later, but from the mouth of the man they had mocked and belittled, as if he were too stupid or too poor or too black to be worth treating like a human being. So he inhaled deeply through his nose, held it for a moment to steady himself, then let it out slowly, feeling the pressure in his chest settle into something cold and sharp. He raised his head and cleared his throat once, loud enough to catch the attention of the nearest rows. A woman 3 seats ahead actually jumped slightly at the sound, turning around with wide eyes. He didn't let himself look away. "I'll explain everything once we land," Ellis said evenly, his voice carrying through the hush with a weight that made even the engines seem to quiet for a moment. "I want them to hear it from me." There was a stir at that, a shuffle of movement, the twitch of heads turning, the tense shift of bodies that couldn't decide whether to lean closer or shrink away. He could see people hesitating, their curiosity warring with the embarrassment of having to face the truth of what they'd seen and heard. He felt every eye on him, and for the first time in hours, it didn't make him want to shrink. It made him sit taller, squaring his shoulders in the tiny, awful seat. He let the silence hold just long enough to be uncomfortable before he spoke again. "My name," he said slowly, clearly, each word punctuated by the thrum of the engines and the weight of silence, "is Ellis Prentice." Someone 2 rows up shifted in their seat, the creak of old upholstery sounding too loud in the hush. A cough cracked the quiet like a pistol shot, quickly stifled. Ellis didn't waver. "I'm the CEO of Prentice Global Logistics," he continued, voice still calm, but unmistakably cold, like frost spreading over glass. "We're the company that provides the infrastructure and supply chain services for this airline." He let that sink in, watched the dawning horror spread across faces as people began to understand what he meant. The older couple who had tutored at his aggression now stared straight ahead, their expressions frozen masks of uncomfortable realization. The silver-haired flight attendant's mouth worked soundlessly, the smirk on, replaced by something far more brittle. Ellis's eyes flicked to him deliberately, pinning him in place like an insect on a card. "We handle your parts, your maintenance equipment, your in-flight catering shipments, your fuel logistics, your emergency response planning," he said, voice sharpening with every syllable. "Every last thing that keeps your planes flying and your doors open." Another rustle ran through the cabin, louder this time, not quite panic, but something like it. The murmur of people realizing they'd been cheering on the humiliation of someone who wasn't just another passenger, but the man whose decisions could destroy them. He watched the fear bloom behind their eyes and felt a grim satisfaction that made the bile in his throat easier to swallow. He didn't bother hiding the bitterness in his voice. "I just canceled your contract," he said flatly. He felt their eyes on him, but they were different now, stripped of the easy contempt, the lazy cruelty of people confident they were punching down. Now they were afraid. Now they were uncertain. Now they were calculating, trying to figure out if they just mocked and humiliated the man who could decide their fate with a word. He could see the dawning panic in their expressions, the way even the ones who'd been filming earlier tried to subtly lower their phones, no longer sure they wanted to preserve this moment in high definition. And he didn't care. He was done caring if they were uncomfortable. Let them squirm. Let them sweat. Let them sit with the realization that the man they'd laughed at was the man who had just crushed them under the weight of his decision. The plane shuddered gently as it hit a pocket of turbulence, the overhead lights flickering for a fraction of a second. And in that moment, Ellis felt the entire fragile facade of their comfortable world tremble with it. Somewhere up in first class, a man's voice broke the silence with a strangled expletive as his phone buzzed on the tray table, screen lighting up with a series of rapid notifications. Others followed quickly, the chimes and buzzes multiplying, an urgent, discordant symphony of disaster. Ellis didn't even have to see the headlines to know what they said. He could imagine them with perfect clarity. Major airline loses $5.8 billion contract in mid-air meltdown. Prentice Global Logistics terminates partnership, stock plummets. Airline faces unprecedented crisis as logistics giant walks away. He didn't smile. There was no joy in it for him, only grim satisfaction that for once in his life, there would be consequences. He adjusted his grip on his duffel bag, the canvas rough beneath his palms, and let the panic unfold around him. A woman in business attire frantically tried to connect to in-flight Wi-Fi, cursing under her breath when the load screen lagged. A man in a golf shirt and loafers was muttering to himself, stabbing angrily at his phone screen as notification after notification popped up with words like freefall and emergency cell. Across the aisle, the silver-haired flight attendant was pale as chalk, his posture no longer straight and commanding but slumped with a weight of dread, his eyes darting between passengers and Ellis like he couldn't decide if he should apologize or flee. Further up, a couple in first class argued in panicked whispers, their voices rising until even the flight attendants dared not intervene. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, brittle with forced calm that fooled no one. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected news this evening. We want to thank you for your understanding as we address questions upon landing. The lie was so thin it tore apart in the air as soon as it was spoken. The buzz in the cabin surged louder, the fear contagious, running from row to row like fire through dry grass. Passengers who had snickered at Ellis's discomfort were now frozen with their hands over their mouths, eyes wide, watching their investment portfolios burn in real time. Some were already on the phone, the airline's app crashing under the demand as they tried desperately to salvage their travel plans and finances alike. Ellis watched it all with a kind of detached clarity, his breathing slowing as the shaking in his fingers began to ease. He wasn't glad they were suffering, but he felt something settle in his chest that had been raw and bleeding all day, a sense of balance being restored. Actions had consequences. Words had weight. The airline staff seemed to have collectively realized the gravity of the situation, their forced cheer and corporate polished smiles collapsing under the strain of what they'd done. The silver-haired attendant hovered at the back, casting furtive glances at Ellis that were almost pleading, as if willing him to say it wasn't true, that this was all a bluff. But Ellis didn't look at him anymore. He didn't need to. Instead, he leaned back against the hard seat, letting the vibrations of the engines buzz through his bones, and let himself go still for the first time all day. Up in the cockpit, the captain was receiving frantic messages from corporate headquarters, orders and apologies tumbling over each other, the desperate pleas to contain the story before it spread further, before the stock market opened in Asia, before the news anchors got wind of it. But it was too late. News outlets were already tweeting the story. Screenshots of Ellis's announcement were being shared on social media, retweeted and reposted, with commentary ranging from outrage to applause. Financial blogs began publishing updates mid-flight as word spread that the airline had lost its biggest logistics contract in one humiliating stroke, a partnership that had underpinned their entire just-in-time supply chain strategy. Stock tickers turned red. Ellis Prentice walked slowly through the quiet city streets as dawn light began to warm the glass and steel of the buildings around him, the cool breeze ruffling his coat, his breath visible in the chill air. It had been months since that flight, months since a single decision had shattered the carefully polished facade of an entire airline's reputation and financial stability, since videos of him being mocked and searched and shoved had gone viral and triggered a corporate collapse that analysts were still dissecting on news panels. The airline had issued half-hearted apologies, promised reviews of its policies, fired a handful of employees for misconduct, and paid out a settlement that couldn't erase the stain on its name. Their stock price never fully recovered. They'd been forced to sell off assets, cut routes, negotiate new contracts at a premium with competitors who smelled blood in the water. Ellis's own company had absorbed the logistical gap with ruthless efficiency, growing its market share even as he carefully stayed out of the spotlight, refusing every interview request. He hadn't done it for the publicity. He hadn't done it for revenge. He had done it so they would learn. And in the months that followed, that lesson had spread. Other airlines revised their training manuals. Customer service departments held mandatory workshops. Industry panels invited him, awkwardly, hesitantly, to speak about bias and dignity and the price of forgetting someone's humanity. He didn't accept all of them, but he went to a few. He watched the executive squirm as he described in clinical detail how quickly he decided to pull the contract, how easy it was when you'd already been compiling a list of every small slight, every missed meeting, every arrogant assumption, how he had warned them, politely and professionally, and they hadn't listened. How in the end it wasn't one big mistake, but 1,000 small choices that added up to losing everything. Now, months later, he pushed open the door of a local coffee shop, the warm scent of roasted beans and cinnamon a welcome balm against the cold outside. The bell overhead jingled softly. The shop was small, with wooden tables and mismatched chairs and a bulletin board cluttered with local events, lost pet flyers, and handwritten notes. At one table near the back sat 2 people he recognized instantly, even though they had tried to change. The former gate agent, now wearing a simple polo and khakis, hair grown longer and messier, fidgeted with the sleeve of his shirt like it didn't fit quite right. Next to him, the silver-haired flight attendant wore a soft gray sweater instead of his old pressed uniform, his posture slumped in a way Ellis had never seen before. They weren't just customers. They had aprons on. He watched as they wiped down tables, refilled creamers, swept stray crumbs into their hands. The gate agent tried to joke with a customer at the counter and stumbled over his words. The flight attendant took an order politely, nodding, voice so quiet it barely carried. Neither noticed Ellis at first. He stood there watching them, remembering the way they had treated him like he was invisible until they wanted to make him small. How they had relished making him stand aside, tearing his ticket, patting him down in front of an entire cabin of watching strangers. How they had laughed. He had been told by mutual contacts that after the scandal they'd been blacklisted from aviation. No airline wanted the PR risk of hiring them. They'd bounced through a series of short-lived retail jobs. Now they were volunteering here twice a week, part of a mandatory community service component of the racial sensitivity program they'd been ordered to complete to get steady work again. Ellis could have turned around and left, could have decided it wasn't worth it, that they weren't worth it. But instead he moved forward, boots scuffing softly against the old wooden floor. The gate agent looked up first. His eyes went wide, color draining from his face as he recognized Ellis. The flight attendant turned a second later, mouth falling open. Silence fell over their corner of the shop. Neither spoke. Ellis stopped a few feet away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't let the old anger poison his words. He spoke clearly, calmly, the way he had when canceling the contract, but with something softer beneath it, something that felt almost like mercy. "I heard you were volunteering here," he said. His voice was even, but they both flinched at the sound of it. The gate agent swallowed, looking down, fingers twisting around the rag in his hand. "We were trying to do better," he said hoarsely. The flight attendant's eyes were wet. He wiped them quickly, ashamed to be crying in front of the man he'd humiliated. "They're making us take classes," he managed, voice cracking. "We're supposed to learn." Ellis nodded once, slow and deliberate. He let the silence settle around them, heavy with the memory of all the things that hadn't been said on that plane, the way they had treated him, the way everyone had laughed, the cost of forgetting someone's humanity. Then he extended his hand. The gesture shocked them both. The gate agent blinked rapidly. The flight attendant just stared at the offered handshake like it might burn him. But Ellis didn't withdraw it. He held it there, steady and patient. "Change," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the stillness of the shop, "is why I did it." The words hit the 2 men like a slap and an embrace at the same time. Slowly, hesitantly, the gate agent reached out and took Ellis's hand, his fingers trembling. The flight attendant wiped his eyes again and put his hand over theirs. No one spoke for a long moment. The coffee shop around them continued its quiet murmur of clinking cups and low conversation, oblivious to the small act of grace unfolding in its corner. When they finally let go, Ellis nodded once more, turned, and left the shop. Outside, the morning was brighter, the sun cutting through the cold in pale golden bands. He took a deep breath, feeling the air expand in his lungs. He hadn't forgotten what they'd done. He never would. But he also refused to be the reason no one changed. And as he walked away, the bell over the door jingling softly behind him, he let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, the lesson had stuck. The end. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to know what you think about the plot. Did the ending land for you? Was the journey as tense and satisfying as you hoped? Share your thoughts in the comments. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from today? Let's talk about it below.